everybody, and welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. We've got a fantastic panel today to discuss diversity and innovation in Japan and the UK. And we are chaired by Sir Hugh Fortazzi on the far side there, and I'll leave it to him to introduce the other two, but I will just introduce Sir Hugh briefly. I'm sure he's known to most of you. He was the ambassador to Japan from 1980 to 1984. After a long career in the diplomatic service, he has written numerous books and articles about Japan, not only in English but also in Japanese. Some of them I think were never translated into English. And he continues to write actively about Japan, particularly in the Japan Times. I think it seems to be the main forum at the moment, and continues to be quite critical of Japan in many respects. But I'll leave it at that, Hugh, and leave it to you to introduce the other two speakers. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's amazing to see so many coming out on election day, but perhaps you're all as bored with the election as I am. Looking at the agenda and at your distinguished speakers this evening, I couldn't help feeling that it would be difficult in finding much disagreement between us on the question of the need for greater internationalism and of both different attitude towards our neighbours, in the case of Britain and of Japan. So perhaps I should express my own, just at least warn you of my own prejudices. In the case of Japan, I am prejudiced very strongly against the Nihonjinron, or that Japan is unique, and very much prejudiced in favour of Japan being much more internationally minded. But I won't go beyond that. As far as Britain is concerned, my prejudices certainly are in favour of Britain within Europe. I would be very reluctant to see, or I think it would be appalling if Britain were to be a Brexit, which might be combined with a Scoxit. But I think that's enough from me as chairman. We'll have two very distinguished speakers. First of all, Dr. Funabashi, who, as you have been told, is the chairman of the Rebuild Japan Initiative Foundation, and was very much important in foreign affairs in relation to the Asahi, which he was. I think the Asahi, as probably you all know, has been suffering from certain pressures from the Japanese government, which I deplore. Maybe he will want to answer some questions on that later, I don't know. And of course, Charles Grant is all known to you, particularly for his work in relation to Europe and reform in Europe, and I'm quite sure he too takes a strong view about Britain within Europe. But that is enough from me. May I ask Dr. Funabashi if you would like to start the ball rolling? Thank you very much.
Mr. Kotachi, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm very much pleased to be here once again, and I very much appreciate your coming and joining this session. I would like to introduce a book we recently published. Actually, we published it last week. This is Examining Japan's Lost Decades. This is a compilation of 15 essays, all focusing on Japan's lost decade and its significance, its meaning. I would like to introduce some essence of the fact-finding and some insights to you today. But actually, I have had a peculiar habit. Whenever I have my book published, actually I have published more than 40 books in the past, I will celebrate the birth of a new book and hugging the book very close to your face. In Japanese, hozuri. So if you would excuse me, I would like to christen the birth of my new book like this, But in this book, actually, we really try to analyze why Japan actually has lost 2 decades, actually, so long and so deep. But nonetheless, it's amazing to see we have not had any social unrest, large scale. And the society actually has remained to be stable. But it has been financed various ways. So no wonder Japanese budget deficit has ballooned. The public debt to GDP ratio leaped up from 71% in 1992 to 230% in 2011. We all know that it's not sustainable forever. But somehow it has been sustained, even though it topped above 150%, or even 90%, the indicator for some analysts to reach very much dangerous level. I often have met with foreign friends in Tokyo whenever they visit Japan. Actually, after they notice that there are society and economy in Tokyo, in Japan, particularly in big cities like Tokyo, they would really scratch their head in puzzlement and wonder about the veracity of the lost decades that we have been focused on. Whenever we talk about lost decade, Yoichi, where's lost? What's lost? It's not lost yet. But when you really see that picture very deep down, actually Japan still is confronted with serious risks and challenges. That I just would like to limit 2 big themes. One is that macroeconomic picture, which I just mentioned, and another one is population. But before getting into that, just would like to touch on the lessons we learned from Fukushima nuclear crisis. Actually, we published our first report at the Institute to critically review the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Our conclusion was that it was a crisis of governance. TEPCO first argued and claimed that it was beyond the control of human agency. It is a sort of force majeure. But we defined it at our institute in our first report that it was man-made, caused by the crisis management, risk management, I should say, and governance, and leadership, the failures of those elements. Particularly, we found the essence of Japan's problem, total unpreparedness for this critical occurrence in what we call Galapagos Syndrome. Galapagos Syndrome actually has been used, this word, in Japanese business community, referring to a phenomenon of some Japanese products evolving in total isolation from the rest of the world. And some Japanese companies, particularly engineers, have become to believe this Galapagos phenomenon actually reflects and even represents the uniqueness of Japan and also the excellence of Japan. So they have actually been so much focused, particularly focused on the Japanese domestic market and in fierce competition to prove their excellence. Completely out of the context of out of that world. So when they are confronted with the globalization, they are in deep trouble because they are so singularly focused on partial optimization that they miss out on a big picture or global market or what it really matters. Another Fukushima discovery of Fukushima crisis is that the collusive nexus of that what we call nuclear village of community, consisting of the politicians and bureaucrats, scholars, engineers, and some media people who have been promoting nuclear energy, and they're forming a very close-knit, highly exclusive community, and in which they tend to prevent the opposing views, outsiders, from expressing views and challenging their official line or company policy, particularly concerning the safety practice and culture. So this also is coupled with a very much stovepiped structure of the Japanese government, bureaucracy, as well company, among the departments, and also silo mentality. They have suffered from, and this actually poses a very fundamental challenge to governance. So to overcome that, it requires strong and effective leadership. But unfortunately, that leadership has been very much missing over the past 20 years of lost decade. 19 years period between 1992 to 2011, that's lost decade period. So as many as 14 governments. And this ineffectiveness of the government institutions in Japan at this period actually parallels that of 14 governments between Manchurian incident in 1931 and the end of Japan's defeat in 1945 at the end of the World War II. And during this period, the political procrastination was very much pronounced, and particularly when Japan had to deal with that non-performing loan after the bubble burst. It took 7 to 8 years for the government to decide to inject public money to deal with that non-perfect law. So that was a salient feature of the first part of that lost decade. The core problem of Japan's macroeconomic policy making was the discoordination or lack of coordination between the government, particularly Ministry of Finance, and the BOJ, the central bank in Japan. And this lack of coordination was very much salient in decision-making process of fiscal and monetary policy. For instance, when after the Japanese government actually started to inject fiscal stimulus in late 1990s, the monetary policy actually was not mobilized to match the fiscal policy. And instead, the BOJ has had the bias of deflationary drive. The first day actually overkilled the bubble. And then they regarded that deflation as a sort of good deflation, which caused that high yen appreciation in late 1990s, which further drove the deflation down. And then premature decision to raise that zero interest rate in 2001 after BOJ was independent legally completely. So this deflationary bias actually is not Japanese phenomenon. Actually, in 1923, Bank of England a decision to return to the gold standard, and then 1933's infamous Federal Reserve Board interest rate hike was all contributed to deflationary drive. And then now the Bank of Sweden, Riksbank, also has seemed to repeat the same mistake. But nonetheless, this duration and the depth of the deflation is unprecedented. And Abenomics is now designed to attack this root cause of the deflation. And we have now witnessed some positive effects of that Abenomics in the past 2 years. But nonetheless, the danger is that he still will go too slowly, and he perhaps may narrow the window of opportunity as the Bank of Japan is easing and stock price is rising, and his popularity rate is still very high, and baby boomers are still very much healthy. So that's that macro picture. Quickly, I just would like to touch on the population and its challenge to Japan's future. Japan's population, if we continue to persist this current trend and does not address this population bust challenge with that meaningful set of population policies, which actually is completely lacking at this point. Japan's population would likely reduce to 100 million by the mid-century, and even could decrease to 50 million by the end of the century. Japan's population peaked 2008, the level was at 128 million in that year. And before that, the Japanese working population had started to decrease after peaking in 1995. The Japan's fertility rate now is about 1.23, much far below the 2.1 necessary to sustain the population size. And there has been no instance of the population issue surfacing as a political campaign issue, surprisingly so. Even though throughout 1990s that we have seen the gray lobby strengthening their political power, and they put tremendous pressure on the government to increase that pension and medical care budget, and they have been highly successful in doing that, but at the expense of that younger generation. So if the better that gray lobby does, it shortchanges the future. There is no counterbalancing platform or constituencies or political power to compete with this gray lobby in Japan. And this silver democracy issue is not uniquely Japanese phenomenon. It's all share in matured economies, particularly in Europe. So those are the two major challenges that we are confronted with. Lastly, I just read the New York Times article and a Washington Post article last week featuring the possibility of turnaround of Sony. Actually, to many Japanese, the prospect of Sony turning around is sort of regarded as a national revival narrative. And people have been very closely watching how Sony will fare in the coming years. I'm not too familiar with those details and numbers, but according to that report, Sony has started to make profit sizably. And that may be a sign of the turnaround of Sony after almost 20 years of meandering and decrease of Sony's prestige and gravitas. But the jury perhaps is still out, because I'm not so sure how Sony has completely fundamentally changed its governance issues in that corporation. Sony actually epitomizes, symbolizes that corporate Japan's deep problem. In the very initial years, formative years, throughout 1960s, 70s, 80s, Sony was actually a company of diversity. When I covered Sony and Japanese electronic company in late 1970s, Sony's top management, none of them was Sony actually salaried lifer. They all came from the outsiders. Certainly, founder of Sony, Ibuka and Morita, were pure Sony guys, Sony people. But the others, top management, are all recruited. It's really diverse, full of diversity. And in those days, Sony was very young, very innovative, challenging, risk-taking, and I was extremely impressed with particularly Morita and Ibuka. I was very much privileged to get to know them very closely, the two of them. I still remember Ibuka-san telling me whenever he went to the United States, he returned with toys, full of toys, but never presented them to his children without putting them apart first, and then putting that again. And he, told me about this story very proudly. Morita-san also is, I think, a salesman genius, and he once told me that the transistor was a bit too large for the most of the pockets. So he had his salesman wearing little, shirts a little bit larger than the ordinary one, and then to foster the illusion of the portability. Sony's motto is quality, functionality, and portability. So he really valued the portability. So they are very, very, innovative young generation of entrepreneurs. They are completely have been missing, in my view, in the past 20 years or so. The Japanese companies all have been so much successful and established, and rejecting the outsiders, forming the village themselves. Now, I think that's changing. For instance, that benefactors and the supporters of our think tank are almost all of them individual entrepreneurs. We do not actually get any funding from the established Japanese big corporation except for 2 companies. So I have been very much pleased to get to know them, and they're much dynamic. So I still very much pin hope on that breakthrough of those younger generation of entrepreneurs. Thank you very much.
Charles, would you like now to take
Sure,
over?
of course. Well, thank you very much. As was predicted, I tend to agree with what the other members of this panel say. So I'm going to talk mainly about Britain's complicated relationship with the European Union, but I will talk on some of the issues of homogeneity or diversity, which Dr. Fukushima raised. And I will also talk about the issue of EU migration, because that is, if the British vote to leave the EU in a referendum in 2017, which is possible, the single biggest reason they would vote to leave would be because of the issue of migration. That is what would swing it for Nigel Farage's camp if he wins the referendum. As of today, of course, we don't know if there'll be a referendum or not. If the Tories win the election, there will be. If Labour wins, there won't be. But there will be one whenever the Tories win power, and we shouldn't assume they can never win power again, even if they don't win today, because they've been winning elections since the late 17th century. They're quite good at it, and we cannot guarantee they'll never win an election at some point in the future. When they do win one, there will be a referendum, because nobody would ever become leader of the Tory party unless he promised a referendum, because that's, if you're a Tory activist, is the thing that is probably most important in the world, is having this referendum on EU membership. It's worth considering, without knowing the election result, why the British people are so Eurosceptic after having joined the EU in 1973, having voted to stay in it in a referendum in 1975. Why are we amongst the most Eurosceptic peoples of Europe? I think there are some long-standing historical and geographical and cultural reasons, but then there are also some more specific ones relating to what's happened in the last few years. Long-standing one, of course, is history. The British people are rather obsessed with the Second World War. We think we had a jolly good war. Other people were on the wrong side, or they ran away, or were conquered. And this gives us a certain sense of smug superiority. Geographically, we're on the edge of Europe, so we regard Europe as somewhere else. And that has meant that throughout our history, we've had more links with other continents than any other country in Europe, than even the French. So our patterns of migration and trade and investment have been the most global of any country in Europe, which makes us think that Europe is an optional extra rather than a fundamental necessity for us. Then there's the economic factor. Certainly from the mid-1990s until the financial crash, Britain had the most successful large economy in Europe. It didn't look so good after the crash, but now it's come back again the last few years, and now again this makes us think that, you know, we're special, we don't need anybody else's help or advice, and we're very, whether it's Gordon Brown for the Labour Party or George Osborne for the Conservatives, we're very good at telling our partners that they need to follow our lessons and our experience, and we don't have much to learn from them. And then, of course, there's our media, and I worked as a journalist in the 1980s and the 1990s, and 3/4 of the newspapers sold in this country are run on the basis that the journalists are only allowed to write knocking copy about the EU. Journalists are not allowed to present the EU in a positive light, and if they do, they're fired or demoted. And it's amazing, actually, that the opinion polls show the last few months that roughly half the British people want to stay in the EU. Given the diet of lies and exaggerations that are given by the media, I'm quite surprised if that is the case. And of course, the BBC is not particularly biased in any direction, so not everybody luckily believes what they read in the newspapers. There are two specific reasons, though, why Euroscepticism has grown in this country in the last few years, the last 5 or 6. One is the euro crisis. The euro crisis is very serious. I'm not sure if Greece will still be in the euro 3 months from now. I say it's about 50-50. And ever since the euro crisis began 5 years ago, British people have seen, correctly, that the eurozone has been very badly managed, that the people in charge are not economically competent or literate, they can't agree on the diagnosis of the problem, never mind the remedies required to solve the problem. The economic performance of the eurozone has been abysmal. Although it's beginning to grow slightly now, it's still, the output is less than it was before the crisis began. And there's been enormous human suffering in southern Europe because of the euro crisis. In my view, the austere medicine imposed by the Germans has made problems worse rather than better, though I'm certainly with the Germans on the need for structural reform in southern Europe. So anyway, this is not a great advertisement for the EU. So the euro and the EU are different things. The people running the euro also run the EU, and the British people have seen the EU in a very bad light. And the final reason why I think the British people have become particularly Eurosceptic in recent years is the issue of migration. 2004, the accession of 8 East European countries, followed by 2 more in 2007. The British government forecasted a few thousand people would arrive, about 1 million people came. Initially, there was a kind of division, probably according to social class, on whether this was a good thing or not. Middle classes thought it was great. The Polish plumbers worked hard and for not much money, and the cleaners and so on worked wonderfully. Middle class people thought it was great, but not everybody thought it was great, and those people who worked in the building trade certainly didn't think it was great. So there was a kind of class division on it initially. But unemployment didn't go up in 2004 when these 1 million people came, because they were doing jobs that British people didn't want to do, and the economy was doing jolly well. It only became an issue with the recession, which began obviously 2008, 2009, 2010, and because politicians started, and the Eurosceptic media started exploiting migration and making a big issue of it. And now I'm afraid it is one of the most salient issues in British politics. The EU itself is not, but migration is. And it's not just uneducated, unskilled workers who think there's too many migrants in this country. I'm afraid it's educated middle-class people with Cambridge degrees think there are too many migrants in this country. Why do they think it's this? Well, partly I think the media has highlighted the problems more than the benefits. And for example, most people believe that migrants come mainly from the EU. It's not actually true. In the last 10 years, every year, more migrants from outside the EU in the EU. Nobody knows that. It is true in the last couple of years, the EU migration has risen to be almost 50% of total immigration. And the net level of immigration is about 300,000 people a year, which is quite high in an overcrowded country. But people just don't know the facts. People do not know that migrants contribute much more to the British economy than they take up. Some studies which we published in my think tank, the Centre for European Reform, we've shown how that EU migrants pay into the British exchequer much more money than they take out in benefits, because many fewer of them are on benefits than the English people as a whole, the British people as a whole. They tend to come here to work, not to scrounge. And so a lot of the myths about migrants are not true. But you can't blame it on the media. There's also a problem of political leadership. All our main parties, really, perhaps the Liberals a bit less, but obviously the Conservatives noticed the rise of UKIP, which has been one of the big phenomena in British politics in the last 3 or 4 years. Conservatives saw UKIP stealing votes from them on the right. And UKIP, although it's of course an EU withdrawal party, the real reason why it's become popular, scoring perhaps in today's election 12 to 15%, who knows, something like that, hopefully a bit less. The reason it's become so popular is actually the migration issue. Nigel Farage has cleverly made people see the connection, and in this he's telling the truth, between the EU and migration. He says, if you want to control your borders, you have to leave the EU. He's absolutely right about that. You can't control your borders if you stay in the EU. And that goes down very well with all those people who think there's too many migrants. It's not just a failure of political leadership, it's not just the media. There are actually real problems in the provision of public services in some places, because migrants do tend to go and live in the same place as other migrants from the same origin. So in some towns in the East Midlands, in some towns on the east coast of England, there are large numbers of migrants putting pressure on school places and housing. And something that hasn't been talked about in this election campaign, so I believe that something like in the next 5 years of this coming parliament, the requirement for school places will go up about 10%, and it's partly migration, partly homegrown population growth. So there are real issues of public services which more moderate people are concerned about. But so that is why the EU's become such a salient issue. Of course, it's not the only issue driving UKIP. UKIP's been quite clever in not being a fascist party. It's not the British National Party. And Farage, although of course, as David Cameron famously said, UKIP is a party full of fruitcakes, loons and closet racists. And there's some truth in that. But at the leadership level, if you say something racist, you get expelled. So they do kick out the nuttier, loonier, fruitcake-like candidates when they can. And Farage himself is a very, very clever, convincing politician, has a wonderful sense of humour. He's a great public speaker. He does communicate with the common man in a way that Cameron doesn't, and Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg certainly don't. They are all part of the kind of Oxbridge political careerist cadre who run our country. And Farage, like Boris Johnson, is a much more attractive figure for many people in this country. They're also, it's not just migration, it's not just the EU, it's also gay marriage. That's been quite a big issue for UKIP. And it's really putting Britain back to the 1950s. That's my view of UKIP. A lot of people think the 1950s was great. We should go back to a largely white, sensible, moderate, unsocially liberal Britain. That's what they want. Now, as I said, if the Tories win, there will be a renegotiation, and when they win an election, there'll be a renegotiation. What are they going to ask for? Very briefly, let me mention a couple of things. The first thing they're going to ask for is something on migration, because this is what Cameron has made a personal fetish of. He made a big speech on migration last November. He very, very nearly demanded quotas on EU migrants in his speech. A lot of his advisors pushed him to demand that as a way of shooting the UKIP fox. If he had demanded that, there would have been a complete breakdown in his relationship with Germany and every other country, because no other country would agree to even talk about quotas of EU migrants. It's part of the single market, free movement of labour. Luckily, he didn't. He did make a number of other demands, deporting job seekers who've not found work within 6 months, imposing a 4-year period before EU migrants have access to in-work benefits like tax credits, stopping the workers from other member states who live in Britain sending child benefits back to children who live in another country, making it easier to deport criminals, fraudsters and beggars from other member states, and limiting the period for which migrants from other EU countries can claim benefits when they come to live in the UK. Now, the speech was fairly serious and fairly moderate. It's not all feasible. Some of the things he asked for would in fact require treaty change, because they would involve discrimination against workers from other member states. which is against the treaties, but some of them could be achieved with mere legislation rather than treaty change. But that is Cameron's priority. He can get something, I think, there. Second thing he's going to ask for is rather complicated but interesting. It's the relationship between the Eurozone and the single market. You have 19 countries in the Eurozone, and you have 28 countries in the EU in the single market. And there is a potential risk that the countries in the Eurozone, who are in some ways integrating their policy making, will get together, caucus, kind of meet in secret before meetings of the wider EU, and turn up at meetings of the Council of Ministers and impose their wishes on the wider EU and start damaging the single market. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but there is a potential risk that it might happen one day if the Eurozone countries start agreeing on policy much more than they do at the moment. So it's perfectly legitimate for Britain and Sweden and Poland and other countries not in the Euro to ask for safeguards for the single market, protections. There are various institutional mechanisms you could think of to do that, and that will be the second area of British demands. And the third and final thing the British will ask for in renegotiation, rather the Conservatives will ask for, but I should say actually that the Labour Party agrees with the Tories on most of these issues, so they wouldn't demand a renegotiation in the same way, but Labour actually agrees with most of these. But the third thing is the institutional balance of the EU. The Commission, which drafts legislation, should be, according to the treaties, equidistant between the European Parliament, which has a lot of power these days, and the Council of Ministers representing the Member States. What's gone wrong with the EU in the last few years is that the Parliament has grabbed more and more power and made the Commission scared of it, and has made the Commission dependent on it. The Commission is becoming, or has become recently, the creature of the Parliament, which means that it's proposed silly regulations and rules that the Parliament wants. And it's annoyed the Member States enormously. And so one British priority will be to try and reposition the Commission between the Parliament and Council, and part of that is giving national parliaments a bigger say in the way the EU works. Some countries agree with the British on this, some don't at all, but some agree. Now those are the three sort of institutional areas, or three main areas. In addition, of course, the British want to complete the single market, have a digital single market, an energy single market, a capital markets union, less red tape, better regulation, all that kind of stuff. Some of which is happening anyway, actually, because the new commission that took office last November is doing a lot of those things. My last comment on this, and I'm almost at the end, is the big difficulty for Cameron is the issue of treaty change. Because you can't change a lot in the EU without changing the treaties, but changing the treaties is very difficult. You need an agreement of 28 member states in an intergovernmental conference preceded by a convention, and then the new treaty has to be ratified in every member state, in some of them through referendums, and the chances of getting that through are close to zero. No other government wants a treaty change. The Germans did until recently, and now even they don't want a treaty change for reasons I can come back to if anyone's interested. So, but Cameron keeps saying, we want a new treaty, we insist on a new treaty. He just doesn't listen to what the other governments are telling him. And so what he can achieve is frankly quite limited without a treaty change. He can achieve some things. He can achieve, obviously a lot of countries don't want Britain to leave the EU. Think of the impact of Brexit on the EU. There'll be much less economic liberalism because it's the British who campaign and push the single market and trade agreements with other countries. There'll be a much less effective defence policy because the British with the French are the most serious countries militarily. EU foreign policy would be less global, have less capability without the British, who contribute quite a lot to it because of our global reach. Transatlantic relations would be seriously damaged because although the special relationship between the UK and the US should not be exaggerated, we are often the people who explain the US to the other Europeans and explain what's happening in Europe to the US. And finally, the German question becomes more acute without the British. There is a German problem at the moment. Germany runs the EU. We're all too polite to say this most of the time, but because the British are on the way out, and the French have very weak economically, and the Commission is a shadow of its former self, and the Italians are obsessed with their own economic problems, the Germans really run the EU to an extraordinary extent. If you look at the three biggest challenges facing the EU at the moment, Brexit, how to renegotiate with the British, the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and Grexit, or what to do about the Eurozone and Greece, in all three dossiers, whatever Angela Merkel decides happens. She is that dominant, and she's in many ways a good leader, though I disagree with her a bit on the Eurozone. In many ways she's a good, moderate, sensible, competent leader. But it is not healthy for the EU that one country should dominate it in this way. And if the British leave, then of course there's even less counterweight to balance Germany, and the French and the Italians do perceive this very clearly. So I hope that Britain doesn't leave the EU. My last comment, my advice to Cameron, how can he succeed in renegotiating if he does? Firstly, don't overbid. Your party, David, will be pushing you all the time to ask for the unobtainable, to ask for more opt-outs, more special deals for Britain. If you ask for too much, you'll get nowhere and alienate people. Keep your demands moderate. Secondly, you need some friends and allies. Britain has very few friends and allies in the EU. When we had the vote on the new President of the Commission, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, last June, how many people voted with Britain against his appointment? One government voted. The slightly semi-democratic government of Hungary. Viktor Orban was David Cameron's best friend on that day. Nobody else was stand by Cameron. So that's not great. And it's not just a criticism of Cameron and the Tories. The Labour wasn't great either. We're not very good at building alliances. Cameron is particularly bad at it. As his own advisors will admit, he's a transactional politician. He does deals with people. When the deal is done, he forgets about the relationship, and he has not cultivated other member state heads of government. Merkel's a sort of friend on a good day, but only on a good day, and they often misunderstand each other. Thirdly, be clubbable. Clubs have rules and they have mores. The British don't always get the mores of the EU. The mores are, be nice to people, compromise, don't thump the table, don't shout at people. Jonathan Hill, the new man in Brussels, gets this. He's a very good appointment because he's incredibly polite and civilised in the way he deals with people. He's going down very well. Cameron on a good day gets it. The budget negotiations 2 years ago, he managed to shrink the EU budget by working with the Germans and others, and he was polite to people. Sometimes he gets it wrong. He said to one senior person just before Juncker's appointment, it was reported back to me, he said to him, if you force us to accept Juncker, I might recommend a no vote in a referendum, and then you'll be sorry, won't you? That is not a very effective negotiating tactic. When Cameron does that, it doesn't go down well with our partners. Thirdly, have ideas, take initiatives, lead. Britain has a lot of expertise, foreign and defence policy, trade in the single market, energy and climate, but we don't take initiatives at the moment. We leave the Ukraine crisis entirely to France and Germany to lead the EU there. We're not very involved in very many areas. We're very kind of inward-looking government at the moment, but we would get more support if we took the lead. And the very last point, fifth point, make the case for membership. Cameron made a speech at his Bloomberg speech 2 years ago announcing the referendum. It's actually a good speech. He said he would campaign to keep Britain in the EU with his heart and his soul, he said. He explained why the EU was good for Britain. He never followed up. There was never any further statements on the benefits of the EU because he didn't want to lose votes to UKIP, didn't want to upset his own Eurosceptic backbenchers. But and that really pissed off our partners. They thought he wasn't serious about keeping Britain in the EU. But if he does make the case, if he goes on the stump and says that Britain is better off in the EU because, and is prepared to make enemies in his own party, and prepared to take on UKIP and hit them hard, which he hasn't done in this election campaign, then he will win respect from his partners. They will help him, they'll do a deal with him, and he'll come up with a bit of paper saying, good deal for Britain. And he'll put it to the people, and the opinion polls suggest if he does that, and he says it's a good deal for Britain, they will vote to stay in. I hope they do. Thank you.
I'd like to thank our two speakers very much for such clear and interesting presentations. I'd just like to make one point on Charles's point, and that is one argument which you didn't mention for continuing within Europe, and one which is very relevant to Japan, is our debt, is the word, perhaps the wrong word, but the importance of Japanese inward investment for the economy. Realistically, it's the motor car industry would not be what it is without Japanese investment. Of course. And there's no doubt that Japan, if America looks to Britain as a way into Europe, Japan also has done so.
That's a very good point.
The second issue I would like to raise is one which is a general issue, which perhaps applies to both Britain and to Japan, is that both Britain and Japan seem to have developed a capacity to make enemies, perhaps, or perhaps to not to make friends. I mean, Mr. Abe thinks he likes to make friends, but the revisionist element is in fact making enemies for Japan. It's how to create trouble which need not exist.
Yes.
And the same seems to be in the case of Britain. The big issue two issues I'd like to suggest for discussion. One is, why are Britain and Japan becoming so inward-looking? Why is it, for instance, that Japan, which used to send large numbers of people to students abroad, and during the Meiji period it looked to internationally. Now, the Japanese students in Britain have decreased in numbers. Japanese businessmen are fewer in London than there were. This is partly, of course, due to the change in the Japanese economy, but there is, we've heard many people say they deplore the fact that the Japanese no longer wish to live abroad or wish to travel abroad. There is, therefore, also a similar, I mean, I don't think that's true of Britain, but we are inward-looking. And we have the same thing in relation to language. We don't, we think everybody should speak English. There's an arrogance there. The British need to beware of arrogance, but so do the Japanese. The other issue, which I think is that of migration, and where I think both of you have made very interesting points there. But of course, to some extent, Britain has an entirely different problem. It's interesting that nobody in this election, practically nothing has been said about foreign policy, or about defense, even about defense policy, marginally, which is a depressing, I think, for us. At least one could say this of the Japanese government. They have been very much concerned with foreign policy, perhaps too much at times. So, I'm sorry, I mustn't go on commenting, but I do suggest that we do, in the discussion that I hope will follow, with the migration and the inward-looking attitudes is a subject for further discussion.